Have you ever wondered why someone who claims to love you suddenly turns cold and distant the moment you express a need or show vulnerability? The answer lies in how avoidants fall for the fundamental attribution error and blame you for problems they themselves create. This psychological trap explains why relationships with avoidant partners feel like walking through a minefield where every step toward connection somehow becomes your fault. Picture this scenario. You reach out for emotional support after a difficult day, and instead of receiving comfort, you're met with withdrawal and later accused of being too needy or dramatic. What just happened wasn't about your behavior at all. It was about a cognitive bias so powerful that it completely distorts how avoidant individuals interpret your actions and motivations. The fundamental attribution error causes people to explain others' behavior by their character flaws while explaining their own behavior by external circumstances. For avoidants, this bias becomes a weapon of self-protection that destroys the very relationships they secretly crave. Understanding this pattern will transform how you navigate relationships with avoidant individuals. You'll discover why they consistently misread your intentions, how confirmation bias reinforces their negative assumptions about your character, and why projection makes them see their own fears reflected in your actions. More importantly, you'll learn practical strategies to protect your emotional well-being while recognizing that their blame has nothing to do with who you really are. The stakes couldn't be higher. Millions of people trapped in these dynamics believe they're fundamentally flawed because an avoidant partner has convinced them that every relationship problem stems from their inadequacies. Breaking free from this cycle requires understanding the mental gymnastics happening inside the avoidant mind. But here's what makes this even more complicated. Avoidants don't just blame you accidentally. Their brains are literally wired to interpret relationship stress as evidence of your deficiencies rather than their own defensive patterns. This isn't conscious cruelty. It's an unconscious survival mechanism that kicks in whenever intimacy threatens their carefully constructed emotional walls. The tragedy is that their attempts to protect themselves end up destroying the connection they desperately want, but fear they don't deserve. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Now let's explore how this plays out in real relationships through a story that will illuminate the devastating power of these cognitive distortions. Sarah had been dating Michael for 8 months when she noticed a troubling pattern that would eventually unravel everything she thought she knew about love and blame. Sarah worked as a marketing coordinator at a busy agency, and Michael was a successful architect who prided himself on being logical and rational. Their relationship had started beautifully. Passionate conversations, shared adventures, and what felt like a deep emotional connection. But something shifted around the 6-month mark, and Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on what had changed. The shift began with small moments that seemed insignificant at first, but would later reveal themselves as warning signs of a much larger problem. One evening, Sarah had an exceptionally stressful day dealing with a difficult client who rejected 3 rounds of campaign proposals. She came home feeling defeated and looking forward to Michael's support. When she began sharing her frustration, she noticed Michael's body language immediately change. His shoulders tensed, his jaw tightened, and he started scrolling through his phone while she spoke. "You always let clients walk all over you," he said without looking up. "Maybe if you were more assertive, these things wouldn't happen." Sarah felt like she'd been slapped, but Michael's tone was so matter-of-fact that she began questioning whether he might be right. This interaction perfectly demonstrates the fundamental attribution error in action, though Sarah didn't recognize it yet. Michael attributed her difficult day to her personal failings, being too passive, lacking assertiveness, somehow inviting mistreatment. He couldn't see that she was simply having a normal human reaction to workplace stress. Instead of offering comfort, he immediately assigned blame to her character. But here's what makes this story even more revealing. Michael's response had nothing to do with Sarah's actual behavior, and everything to do with his own discomfort with emotional intimacy. The pattern escalated over the following weeks. When Sarah expressed excitement about a promotion opportunity, Michael warned her about getting her hopes up, suggesting she wasn't ready for that level of responsibility. When she felt hurt by his lack of enthusiasm and tried to discuss it, he accused her of being oversensitive and creating drama where none existed. Each time Sarah brought up a concern or showed vulnerability, Michael found a way to make it her fault. She started questioning her own perceptions, wondering if she really was too emotional, too demanding, too much trouble. The breaking point came during what should have been a celebration. Sarah received the promotion she'd been working toward, and she excitedly called Michael to share the news. His response was lukewarm congratulations, followed by concerns about how her new schedule might affect their relationship. When Sarah suggested they celebrate with dinner at their favorite restaurant, Michael reluctantly agreed, but spent the evening pointing out potential problems with her new role. "You're not great with confrontation," he said while cutting his steak. "Managing people requires tough conversations. Are you sure you can handle that?" Sarah's joy crumbled as she realized the person who should have been her biggest supporter had become her harshest critic. That night, Sarah lay awake trying to understand how her relationship had become a source of pain rather than comfort. She began recognizing a pattern she'd been too close to see clearly. Every time she shared something important, whether positive or negative, Michael found fault with her character rather than offering support. When she was stressed, she was weak. When she was excited, she was unrealistic. When she was hurt, she was oversensitive. Nothing she did seemed right, and every emotion she expressed became evidence of her inadequacy. But the real revelation was still coming. During their final conversation, the full scope of Michael's attribution error became crystal clear. Sarah had decided to address the pattern directly, hoping they could work through it together. She carefully explained how his responses made her feel criticized and unsupported, using specific examples and speaking calmly to avoid triggering his defenses. Michael's response revealed the depth of his cognitive distortion. "You're always trying to change me," he said. "You can't just accept people as they are. This is exactly what happened in my last relationship too. She was constantly complaining about how I communicated. The problem isn't me, Sarah. The problem is that you choose men and then try to fix us." In that moment, Sarah saw the fundamental attribution error with startling clarity. Michael attributed her desire for emotional support to character flaws. She was demanding. She couldn't accept people. She was a fixer who chose broken men. He couldn't see that her request for basic emotional responsiveness was completely reasonable. More devastatingly, he couldn't recognize that his pattern of emotional withdrawal and blame had indeed appeared in his previous relationship. Instead of considering that his own behavior might be contributing to these recurring conflicts, he concluded that he simply attracted defective women who unfairly criticized him. The story doesn't end with dramatic reconciliation or sudden insight. Sarah eventually ended the relationship, but not before months of self-doubt had taken their toll. She spent considerable time in therapy, rebuilding her confidence and learning to trust her own perceptions again. Michael, as far as she knew, moved on to another relationship, likely carrying the same patterns and the same certainty that any problems would be his new partner's fault. This story illustrates how the fundamental attribution error doesn't just damage individual interactions. It can systematically destroy someone's sense of self-worth while reinforcing the avoidant person's defensive patterns. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it reveals why logical discussions and emotional appeals often fail with highly avoidant individuals. Their brains are literally interpreting your behavior through a distorted lens that confirms their deepest fears about relationships, while protecting them from examining their own contribution to relationship problems. But knowledge is power, and recognizing these patterns is the first step toward protecting yourself and possibly creating space for healthier interactions. Let's dive into practical strategies that can help you navigate these challenging dynamics while preserving your emotional well-being and sanity. The first crucial step is learning to recognize attribution error in real time, which requires developing what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, the ability to observe your own thoughts and reactions while they're happening. When someone consistently attributes your emotions or needs to character flaws, rather than situating them in context, you're likely dealing with attribution error. Pay attention to language patterns that reveal this distortion. Phrases like, "you always," "you never," "that's just how you are," or "you're too sensitive," are red flags that suggest your partner is explaining your behavior through fixed character traits, rather than considering external factors or legitimate needs. For example, if you express frustration about feeling disconnected in your relationship, and hear "you're just insecure," rather than curiosity about what might help you feel more connected, you're experiencing attribution error firsthand. The key is distinguishing between someone who occasionally misreads a situation and someone who systematically interprets your emotional expressions as evidence of your deficiencies. Think about Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl. Imagine if every time she expressed excitement, hurt, or concern, her partner responded by diagnosing her character flaws rather than engaging with her actual experience. That's the pattern you're looking for. Once you can spot it, you gain the power to respond strategically rather than reactively. Your next line of defense involves what therapists call emotional regulation and boundary setting, which sounds clinical, but actually means protecting your sense of reality when someone else's cognitive biases are distorting it. When faced with attribution error, resist the urge to defend your character or prove that you're not whatever they're accusing you of being. Instead, redirect the conversation towards specific behaviors and situations. If someone says, "you're always so needy," you might respond with, "I asked for support after losing my job," which seems like a reasonable time to need extra connection. Can we talk about how to support each other during stressful times? This approach sidesteps the character assassination and focuses on actionable solutions. This strategy works because it forces the conversation back to observable reality rather than interpretations about your personality. It also models the kind of situational thinking that counteracts attribution error. You're essentially saying, "Let's look at what actually happened in this specific context," rather than making sweeping judgments about who I am as a person. Sometimes this approach can create small openings for more productive dialogue, though you shouldn't expect dramatic changes in deeply entrenched patterns. Building your own cognitive immunity against false accusations requires understanding how confirmation bias amplifies attribution error in avoidant individuals. Confirmation bias makes people notice information that supports their existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. An avoidant person who believes their partner is too emotional will remember every tear but forget every moment of strength, resilience, or emotional regulation. They'll interpret your laughter as evidence that you're too intense, and your silence as proof that you're moody or passive-aggressive. Recognizing this pattern helps you stop taking their distorted perceptions personally. Think about Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You. His confirmation bias makes him interpret Beck's normal social interactions as evidence of her supposed flaws and betrayals. While avoidant attribution error isn't as extreme or dangerous, it follows similar psychological mechanics. Your partner's certainty about your character flaws says more about their cognitive biases than about your actual character. This understanding can be incredibly liberating because it frees you from the impossible task of trying to prove you're not what their distorted lens shows them. The most challenging aspect of dealing with attribution error is maintaining your own emotional equilibrium when someone you care about consistently mischaracterizes your motives and behavior. This requires what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to experience uncomfortable emotions without being overwhelmed by them. When someone attributes your legitimate needs to character defects, the natural response is hurt, anger, and self-doubt. These feelings are completely valid, but they can also cloud your judgment and lead to reactive responses that actually reinforce the avoidant person's negative attributions. Developing distress tolerance means acknowledging your emotional response while choosing your actions strategically. You might feel hurt when your partner calls you clingy for wanting quality time together, but you can choose to respond with something like, "I hear that my request for more time together feels overwhelming to you. What would feel manageable while still helping us stay connected?" This response validates your own need while avoiding the defensive spiral that often reinforces attribution error patterns. One of the most powerful tools for maintaining your emotional stability is what therapists call perspective taking, which involves consciously considering multiple explanations for someone's behavior rather than assuming their actions reflect their feelings about you. When an avoidant partner withdraws or blames you, their behavior might reflect their own emotional overwhelm, past traumas, or fear of intimacy rather than an accurate assessment of your character. This doesn't excuse hurtful behavior, but it helps you avoid personalizing reactions that often have little to do with you. Consider Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris. Imagine if every time she enthusiastically approached a new challenge or relationship, the people around her attributed her behavior to character flaws, rather than recognizing her natural optimism and cultural differences. If Emily took all that criticism as accurate feedback about her personality, she'd lose the very qualities that make her effective and likable. The same principle applies to your situation. The fact that someone misinterprets your emotional expressions doesn't make their interpretation true or meaningful. Creating sustainable change in these dynamics requires understanding when and how to use what relationship experts call strategic vulnerability. This means sharing your inner experience in ways that are most likely to be received accurately rather than filtered through attribution error. Instead of expressing hurt feelings directly, which might be labeled as oversensitivity, you might share observations about patterns. I've noticed that when I share struggles from work, our conversations often shift to what I could have done differently. I'm curious about that pattern and whether we could experiment with different ways of supporting each other. This approach works because it focuses on observable patterns rather than emotions that might trigger the avoidant person's defensive responses. It also positions you as a collaborative problem solver rather than someone making demands or complaints. You're not asking them to validate your feelings, which they may struggle to do authentically. Instead, you're inviting them to examine relationship dynamics from a more objective perspective, which aligns with their preference for logical rather than emotional processing. The final piece of practical advice involves knowing when these strategies aren't working and having a plan for protecting your long-term emotional health. Attribution error patterns can be so persistent and damaging that sometimes the healthiest choice is reducing your emotional investment or ending the relationship entirely. This decision becomes easier when you understand that some cognitive biases are deeply ingrained and may not change significantly, even with awareness and effort. Signs that attribution error has become toxic include consistent character attacks that make you question your own reality, an inability to have conversations about relationship dynamics without being blamed for creating problems, and a pattern where all relationship conflicts somehow become evidence of your inadequacy. If you find yourself constantly defending your basic humanity or wondering if you're as flawed as your partner suggests, the dynamic has likely crossed into emotional abuse territory. Remember that healthy relationships involve two people taking responsibility for their contributions to both problems and solutions. Now let's bring all these insights together and explore what this means for your emotional freedom and relationship future. Understanding how avoidants fall for the fundamental attribution error and blame you represents more than just relationship education. It's a pathway to reclaiming your sense of reality and self-worth after experiencing the confusion and pain these dynamics create. The most important takeaway is that attribution error reveals far more about the person making attributions than about the person being judged. When someone consistently explains your behavior through character flaws while explaining their own behavior through circumstances, they're showing you how their mind processes emotional information. This insight should liberate you from the exhausting cycle of trying to prove your worth to someone whose cognitive biases prevent them from seeing you accurately. You don't need to become less emotional, less needy, or less human to deserve love and understanding. Take action on this knowledge by starting to document patterns in your relationships. Notice when your emotions, needs, or concerns are met with character-based explanations rather than curiosity or support. Practice the language shifts we discussed, moving conversations from character judgments to specific behaviors and situations. Most importantly, begin trusting your own perceptions again if months or years of attribution error have made you doubt your emotional reality. The confirmation bias component of this dynamic means that change, if it happens at all, will likely be gradual and require consistent effort from both people. Don't sacrifice your emotional well-being waiting for someone to develop the self-awareness needed to recognize their cognitive distortions. Instead, use your understanding of these patterns to make informed decisions about how much emotional energy to invest and what kind of relationship is actually possible given these limitations. Consider the projection element we discussed throughout this exploration. When avoidant individuals blame you for relationship problems, they're often projecting their own fears and inadequacies onto your behavior. Their accusations about your neediness might reflect their terror of their own dependency needs. Their criticism of your emotional expression might mask their own discomfort with feelings they've learned to suppress. Recognizing projection can help you respond with compassion while still protecting yourself from unfair blame and criticism. Your future relationships will benefit tremendously from this understanding. You'll be able to recognize attribution error early, before it damages your self-esteem. You'll know the difference between someone who occasionally misreads situations and someone whose cognitive biases systematically distort their perception of your character. Most importantly, you'll understand that healthy love involves two people taking responsibility for their own emotional experiences while supporting each other through life's challenges. This knowledge also empowers you to model healthier attribution patterns in your own relationships. When conflicts arise, practice looking for situational explanations before assuming character-based causes. When someone you care about is struggling, ask yourself what external factors might be contributing to their behavior rather than immediately concluding they're selfish, inconsiderate, or flawed. Breaking these cycles starts with your own commitment to fairer, more accurate ways of interpreting human behavior. The path forward requires courage because it means accepting that some relationships may not be capable of the depth and mutual support you deserve. It means trusting your own emotional experiences, even when someone you love consistently invalidates them. It means choosing your own mental health over the familiar but painful pattern of trying to earn love from someone whose cognitive biases prevent them from giving it freely. This choice isn't selfish. It's self-preserving and ultimately creates space for healthier connections to flourish. Remember that you deserve relationships where your emotions are met with curiosity rather than criticism, where your needs are considered valid rather than evidence of character defects, and where conflicts are approached as problems to solve together rather than opportunities to assign blame. Understanding attribution error and its role in avoidant attachment patterns gives you the tools to recognize and pursue these healthier dynamics. Your emotional reality matters, your needs are legitimate, and you have the right to relationships that honor your full humanity rather than constantly questioning it.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.